Thank you so much, Nasheen, for that fascinating talk. If you're like me, you like to use spolia as a metaphor when teaching a lot of the time, and I'm fascinated by it when traveling, and I always wonder, who can I ask for some real academic knowledge about this? Now I know. Our next paper is from Dr. Edward Holt, who is the interim department head of history and holds the Benjamin A. Quarles Endowed Professorship at Grambling State University in Louisiana. Dr. Holt is a historian of the pre-modern Mediterranean centered on medieval Iberia, whose research focuses on cultural, liturgical, and political articulations of leadership through comparative and transregional perspectives. He is the co-editor of The Sword and the Cross, Castile Leon in the Era of Fernando III, which came out with Brill in 2020. His peer-reviewed articles on medieval Iberian liturgy, kingship, crusade, and geospatial analyses, which we'll be hearing about today, of power have received the Best Early Career Article Prize from the Association of Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies, as well as the Bernard Hamilton Essay Prize from the Society for the Study of the Crusades in the Latin East. Dr. Holt is currently working on a history of leadership and political liturgy in medieval Iberia, which explores how the royal court and ecclesiastical hierarchies of Castile Leon articulated conceptions of rulership, as well as how various subject groups mediated these claims of legitimacy. The floor is yours.
Yes. So I'm getting set up. Thank you, of course, to UCLA, ARMS, all the organizers for this magnificent conference that I'm so thrilled to be able to be a part of. On the 29th of July, 1236, according to Christian sources, Fernando III entered the newly conquered city of Cordoba, returned to the cult of Christianity on the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul. The chroniclers detail the ceremony surrounding the recovery and conversion of the city, notably in its grand mosque, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. In these quotations, we see elements of the 7 steps of the rituals of consecration, including the hanging of crosses, the purification of salt, and prayers. And then I'm so glad that the previous talk was about spolia, because here we also see a wonderful example of spolia, whereby the bells of Santiago de Compostela, which Al-Mansur carried away in the 10th century, turned to lamps in the mosque, are actually ritually carried back to Santiago. And so after this grand display of royal presence, performing the expectations of a crusader king and defender of the faith, through political and religious ceremonies surrounding the recovery of this previously Christian territory, Fernando III departs. It's not unexpected due to the itinerant nature of 13th century Iberian rulership. But what is perhaps more surprising is that Cordoba, despite its importance to the various Islamic polities of al-Andalus, does not ascend into a spot of greater relevance in Christian Iberia. If one were to measure importance based upon charter evidence, it would be of note that while in the top 10 places of issuance for the reign of Fernando III, it falls well short of the 4 major capitals of the realm, a fact corroborated over a longer durée of several centuries of Castilian monarchical reigns by Fernando Aristide. In fact, it's the envisioned capital of Seville that we just heard about that eclipsed the place of Cordoba. Here, despite the relatively short span of 4 years, Seville accrues as many charter issuances as Valladolid. The place where Fernando III was proclaimed ruler at the beginning of his reign in 1217, nearly 30 years earlier than the recovery of Seville in 1248. It was in Seville that Fernando III placed his legacy and established himself following its recovery. It's not to say that Fernando III never returned to Cordoba following the conquest of 1236. Based upon his itinerary, we know that he visited the city at least 6 additional times over the remaining 16 years of his reign. From 1236 to 1241, Cordoba functioned as a militarized frontier society. The lengthy stay towards the end of 1240 to early 1241 was an attempt to assist the repopulation of the area and resulted in the warding of the town's fuero on March 3rd, 1241. And other stops perhaps were a convenient way station while trying to take over other Andalusian towns such as Jaén or Seville. But in either case, the maintenance of royal presence could not rely on the consistent physical presence of the ruler. While scholars assert the role that rulers play in demonstrating their authority through ceremonies like coronation, knighting, weddings, royal entries, etc., there's usually singular events with limited audiences. They fail to create a sustained presence of leadership that fits into the daily rhythm of everyday life, asserts a horizon of expectations for authority, and makes these understandings of authority habitual. In previous work, I've looked at several ways that Castilian rulers have made their presence felt at a polity-wide level. But today I want to shift my focus from the macro to the micro, from the polity of Castile-Leon to the locality of Cordoba. In so doing, I aim to show more contested identity, one where there is a point of encounter between various groups that, through promoting a royal agenda, hope to be able to assert their own vested interests. And interestingly, it fits into what we spoke about yesterday, that global history really is this accretion of microhistories. And so I hope to add this one, not necessarily as maybe one to pull out, but to add to this global narrative that we're working with. And so dotted across the landscapes of medieval Cordoba, Spain, are 12 churches linked to the 1236 Christian recovery of the territory in al-Andalus. Known collectively as the Fernandine Churches, Iglesias, Fernandinas, they memorialize the 13th century Castilian monarch and serve as a part of a plan for the royal reorganization of the city. But what is the relationship between these churches and the namesake? And in the rest of the talk that follows, I'm going to investigate through a digital visualization of medieval Cordoba the ways in which these sacred spaces constructed a memory of the monarch. It'll showcase a virtual reality world and digital storytelling using architectural software, here Trimble SketchUp Pro, as a pragmatic process of creating geographically accurate 3D medieval cityscapes that use digital layering of qualitative and quantitative data gathered from primary sources, maps, and plans, and secondary studies. Reflecting the interreligious reality of the Mediterranean, these churches under investigation represent a variety of religious orders, as well as historical traditions, including imperial, Visigothic, and Islamic. These articulations of power legitimized royal authority, even following the death of the monarch, and reciprocally benefited the institutions through the connection to the crown and Fernando III. And before I move further in this example of hybridity, I want to do a brief caveat that this research is really in its preliminary stages. And in some ways, it's not only a historical investigation, it's a technological one as well. And as we know in digital humanities, it's really about this process and talking about it in an iterative fashion. So I appreciate your grace at this iterative process and look forward to feedback as the project continues and refines trajectories. A technological, as this project is concerned with new ways of enacting spatial analysis and developing immersive environments for both research and pedagogical purposes. Two-dimensional maps for Cordoba existed from the early modern period forward. Here's a map. Here's another map that shows the city here, actually showing the collations, the divisions of it. And then here's another map that comes from the magnificent work of Heather Ecker on the process of transition in al-Andalus, using a 19th century map to plot information about the parish system and the respective churches. And then finally, there's the magnificent project done by the European Research Council, Project Petrifying Wealth, under the direction of Ana Rodriguez and Sandro Carocchi, which plot nearly 19,000 different buildings constructed between the 11th and 13th centuries in Iberia, Italy, and southern France. Data making a digital turn and providing an interactive database whose layers allow for various means of analysis. Although I couldn't help but think, Toby, of your talk yesterday about the sort of disassociation of these points and sort of how you actually can really grapple with these spaces. And so maybe I'll suggest a different way to do that. But my particular work plans to build on these models of spatial analysis through the construction of an immersive environment. As a project participant in the National Endowment for the Humanities Institute for Advanced Topics in Digital Humanities on the Immersive Global Middle Ages, I've been part of a group under the direction of Roger Martinez de Villa and Lynn Ramey that has sought to integrate immersive technologies into the realm of humanistic disciplines without disrupting the traditional disciplinary foundations. This institute served as a gateway initiative, fostering skill development and capacity building among participants who sought to incorporate immersive technologies into research, education, and public engagement within the context of the global Middle Ages. In particular, the Institute employed SketchUp Pro, we'll click play, SketchUp Pro to create original digital assets, objects, architecture, terrain, and to generate geographically accurate cityscapes and historical communities. Using this software, humanities professors can eliminate their dependence on computer sciences, although they're great as a research team, or external contractors to build their world. SketchUp Pro. And so in order to get to this, I want to briefly walk through some of the steps. Starting with the map itself, I've imported two different base layers. The first is a georeferenced map of a section of medieval Cordoba. Through the introduction of this material, one has the ability not only to have an aerial overview, but to also import the topography of the land. For someone working in Cordoba, this has less of an impact because it's relatively flat. However, toggling on topography allows one to see the differences in elevation between the two divisions of the city, the villa and the autarquía on the right. In addition to this, I've imported a map of the parish divisions, collations, which I placed over the georeferenced map in order to make sense of the divisions of space. Next, we turn to populating the space with different digital assets. As you can note, I've initially placed an oriented markers for the, and this is why I talk about it as iterative. I placed markers for the 12 Iglesias Fernandinas where they are georeferenced and located. And so then the process would be to remove those blocks and replace them with the built churches themselves. And so we see that going on. The nice thing is, and so here you see some more images of what a final result for a particular collations would look like. And so the advantage for this, the true advantage of the immersive technology is the ability to construct the buildings themselves. It can be accomplished in a variety of ways. One of the most productive are if the assets have already been created. For instance, the mosque already exists, so you actually can go to the warehouse, type in 3 words, Grand Mosque Cordoba, click enter, and then download it. And so you can actually go home today, tomorrow, or whenever you go back home, and actually go ahead and embed it and use in your classroom. But then for the other ones, the ones that do not exist, it's a combination of using magnificent architectural studies that already exist, really building on that work, but you can also utilize technologies such as Google Maps, which has a great measuring feature that you can go and measure those things. And then from there, one's able to develop and refine working models that can be imported into a final product. I've subsequently used VR and 3D rendering plugin called Enscape to create final outputs from SketchUp. And as you can see, it's a work in progress. However, it's possible to see the potential as the remaining reference blocks are replaced with 3D models and additional information is layered into the map. Furthermore, each of these buildings can be further refined. And although I don't have time in this presentation, this world will be available in VR and compatible with a number of viewers. Therefore, you can don a VR headset, transport it to space and time, and actually be able to wander through the Iglesias Fernandinas in Cordoba and gaze up at them. And so with the remainder of my time, I want to focus on some preliminary conclusions for what happens when this group of churches are analyzed as a unit. As mentioned before, the Iglesias Fernandinas are a collection of 12 churches in Cordoba that are associated with the memory of Fernando III and the Christian recovery of the territory. The churches themselves have a varied history of construction, but for the most part began in the late 13th century and concluded initially by the mid-14th century. They've been described as architecturally derivative, which is a side, terrible thing for somebody building a church for a religious purpose, spending their whole life on it, and then a historian coming by like, it's derivative for it, but here we are. This judgment of some historians who note the rather basic late Romanesque design intermixed with proto-Gothic and Woodhart elements. The buildings themselves are identifiable due to their construction as a singular nave with 2 aisles, usually without a transept or an apse. While the design apparently is lackluster, the collations that they anchored serve not only a religious but also political control, as well as to some extent social cohesion following the repopulation of the areas. However, as can be noted from the map, the Iglesia Fernandinas do not strictly correspond to the 14 parish divisions of the city of Cordoba. It is of note that perhaps maybe the more densely populated areas closest to the cathedral do not receive such a building, but of course there are churches in both of those cloisons. And it's also noted that there are two cloisons that have two buildings represented. The first in San Andres, here, has both San Andres and San Pablo, the latter being a Dominican settlement granted immediately following the conquest of territory in 1236, a fact confirmed by a charter from 20 February 1241 concerning water rights and noting the previous establishment of the territory. And the other is just north of that in Santa Marina, with the addition of San Agustin, given to the Augustinian canons. I'd be remiss, since I just mentioned two groups of monks and also one group of mendicants, to not mention the other group of mendicants, which are the Franciscans, which are given the space to the south, Church of San Francis and San Iglesias. However, this means that the Church of St. Nicholas de la Argentina is not included in the list of 12 Fernandine churches. The churches themselves evoke a connection to Fernando III, but their sites were not accidental. In many cases, they intentionally mapped onto existing neighborhood mosques, in one sense, a convenient use of the space, and in another, an overt act of conquest to take over these sites of worship. Moreover, it sets up the Christian ruler as the heir to the political legacy in taking over the spaces. Most notable in the Grand Mosque, we can see in the other former neighborhood mosques that existed on the sites of San Lorenzo, which is built over a mosque built by Al-Muhira, the son of Abdurrahman III, the sibling of Al-Hakam II, or in Santiago, which was built over one erected by Hisham I. It also enacts a recovery of former Christian past due to many of these sites having previously been the place of Visigothic worship, such as the sites of San Andres and Santa Marina, among others. But even more interesting is the choice of San Pablo, the Dominican area, which situated itself near the old Roman temple on the Via Augusta, thus making this Iglesia Fernandina have an imperial Roman claim in connection that links back to the imperial cult of Domitian in the 1st century AD. Finally, we should speak about the naming conventions used for these sites. The churches of San Pedro and San Pablo commemorate the feast of Peter and Paul and highlight the date of recovery of the city, mentioned above, coinciding with their feast day. But in the instance of capture, as well as in the later naming conventions, they display a possible imperial crusading residence, as not only are Peter and Paul the feast day saints of the day of conquest, they're the patron saints of Rome. And in 1217, in anticipation of the Fifth Crusade, Honorius III had organized a procession, and at the head of this procession was not a relic cross, but as you may have guessed, the relics of the heads of apostles Paul and Peter. In terms of crusading references, it's hard not to mention the figure of Santiago, one of the major Iberian crusading patrons alongside the Virgin Mary. The structure represents, or so this whole collective represents figures that reinforce, above the crusading residence, reinforce really the institutional structure of the church, referencing a variety of apostles and bishops. And what's also interesting is there are not many individuals connected with ancient Cordoba, or the ancient Visigothic past. This direct connection is left to the site itself, but is not necessarily in the naming of the attendant churches. Those individuals with a connection to Iberia instead are more focused on the role of a martyr, such as in Santa Marina of Agua Santa, 2nd century martyr from Orense, St. Eulogius, paired up with St. Francis, and evoking the situation of the 9th century Cordoban martyrs, or Santo Domingo de Silos, who among his many other hagiographic things, ransomed individuals from the Muslims. The varied use of local and universal saints presents a rich tapestry of associations and resonances for the collective Iglesias Fernandinas. Ultimately, these 12 patrons serve as a spiritual wall to coincide with the actual walls of Cordoba in order to serve a frontier town as it sought to reestablish a Christian presence in the decades following the 1236 Christian conquest. And so in the time that I've had here today, and as a brief means of conclusion, I've started to ruminate on the place of the Iglesia Fernandinas and the legacy of Fernando III and the history of the city of Cordoba. I've also begun a conversation about the role of these immersive environments as a frontier of research and data analysis. I think it's a bit too early to leave with any definitive conclusions. However, I hope to say that in the future, through this visual examination, the relationship of Fernando III and the Castilian monarchies with the Fernandine Churches of Cordoba will allow for a more localized discussion of royal power beyond the figure of the king, as well as the hybridity found in the site of encounter. One that is available through digital tools And because its availability through digital tools, people will gain a broader public audience, as well as demonstrate a platform to engage with our students and advocate for a place for the relevance of the pre-modern in our globalized world. Thank you.